It was a warm Saturday afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun was shining brightly, and a light breeze made the trees sway gently. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and the sound of birds chirping added to the peaceful atmosphere. In the middle of this calm, something exciting was happening in one of the houses at the end of the street. The Thompson family had just moved into the neighborhood a few weeks ago. It was their first summer in this new home, and they were ready to enjoy it. Mr. Thompson, a proud father and recently promoted police captain, decided to host a big family BBQ in their backyard. It wasn't just a simple cookout. It was a celebration of new beginnings, of settling into their new life. His wife, Mrs. Thompson, and their 2 children helped prepare everything. The kids were running around, laughing, and playing with their cousins. The smell of grilled chicken, burgers, and vegetables filled the air, making everyone's stomach growl with anticipation. As the family enjoyed their time, the BBQ grew more lively. Music played softly in the background. Friends and family gathered around, chatting and sharing stories. Everyone was in a good mood, celebrating the warm day and each other's company. Mr. Thompson was standing near the grill, flipping burgers and steaks. His calm, confident smile showed how happy he was to have his family together. It had been a long time coming, this fresh start, and he was enjoying every moment. He was proud of his accomplishments and excited to be in his new role as a police captain. It meant a lot to him, not just because of the promotion, but because he could now serve his community in a greater way. But while the Thompsons were enjoying their afternoon, not everyone was as happy. Across the street, in a house with a neat lawn and a perfectly trimmed hedge, one neighbor was not too pleased. Mrs. Carter, an older woman, had been watching the BBQ from her front window for the past hour. The noise, the laughter, the music, it was all too much for her. She didn't like the large gathering. She didn't like how loud it was getting. And she certainly didn't like the fact that it was a black family hosting the BBQ. Mrs. Carter had lived in this neighborhood for years, and she wasn't used to seeing people who weren't like her. The Thompsons were different in her eyes, and she didn't like it. As the party continued, Mrs. Carter's frustration grew. She didn't understand why they had to be so loud and so visible. With her arms crossed and a stern look on her face, she watched them for a little longer. Finally, she made up her mind. She would do something about it. She didn't have the courage to confront the family herself, so she decided to call the police. The afternoon sun was still high in the sky as the Thompson family continued to enjoy their BBQ. Mr. Thompson was laughing with his brother, while Mrs. Thompson and their 2 children were playing games and serving food to their guests. The backyard was filled with the sounds of happy chatter, clinking glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter from the kids. Everything seemed perfect, a typical family gathering. But across the street, Mrs. Carter wasn't enjoying herself at all. She had been staring out of her window for the last hour, watching the BBQ with growing discomfort. The noise from the gathering was starting to get to her. Every burst of laughter, every song that played through the speakers, made her frown a little more. She didn't like the idea of so many people having such a good time. It felt like too much, and she didn't like how things were changing in her neighborhood. She shook her head, muttering to herself, "This is too much. It's getting out of hand." Mrs. Carter was no stranger to quiet, calm days. In her eyes, this was too loud, too big, and it bothered her. Finally, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let this go on. She didn't know how to deal with the situation on her own, so she grabbed her phone from the table and dialed the police. "Hello? Yes, I'd like to report a loud party. It's getting out of control and it's disturbing the peace." She spoke into the phone with an air of certainty, as though this would solve the problem. "There's a big group of people in the yard, and it's just too much noise. Can you send someone over to take care of it?" Mrs. Carter felt a little relief as she hung up the phone. She didn't have to deal with it anymore. The police would handle it, and everything would go back to normal. She could already imagine the officers showing up, telling the family to quiet down, or even asking them to go inside. In her mind, That was the only way to restore peace. Back at the Thompson house, no one had any idea that trouble was brewing just across the street. Mr. Thompson continued to smile, flipping another burger on the grill. His kids were running around the yard, enjoying their time in the sun. Mrs. Thompson handed out drinks to their guests, chatting and laughing with everyone. They were all simply enjoying a beautiful afternoon with friends and family. But suddenly, the distant sound of sirens caught their attention. The Thompsons paused for a moment, looking toward the street, confused. The sirens were getting closer, but none of them had called the police. It seemed strange that the police would be coming to their peaceful BBQ. They didn't think anything of it at first. Maybe there was an emergency down the road. But as the sound grew louder, Mr. Thompson's calm expression shifted slightly. He glanced at his wife, his face showing curiosity. "I wonder what's going on," he said, brushing it off. But in the back of his mind, a small knot of worry began to form. Then the unmistakable sound of a police car pulling up to the curb broke through the background noise. The Thompson family stopped what they were doing and looked at each other, confused. They hadn't done anything wrong. What could this be about? The sound of the police car pulling up to the curb seemed to freeze the moment. The Thompson family stared, surprised, as the officer stepped out of the car. He was a young man, probably new to the job, looking a bit nervous as he approached their front yard. Mr. Thompson, still standing near the grill, exchanged a quick glance with his wife. "Do you think this is about us?" Mrs. Thompson whispered, her voice filled with confusion. Mr. Thompson shrugged. "I don't know, but let's see." The officer walked up to the driveway, clipboard in hand, as if he was prepared for something official. He looked at the large gathering in the backyard, then back at the house, trying to assess what was going on. He wasn't sure why he had been called, but the scene before him seemed to be in order. A family BBQ, people laughing, the smell of food in the air. Everything looked normal. "Hello, sir," the officer called out to Mr. Thompson, who had noticed the officer's approach and walked over to greet him. "I'm Officer Jenkins. I was called about a noise complaint from the neighbor down the street." Mr. Thompson, slightly confused, raised an eyebrow. "A noise complaint?" "Yes, sir. The neighbor mentioned that the gathering here was too loud and disturbing the peace." Officer Jenkins' voice was steady, but there was a slight nervousness behind it. It was clear he wasn't sure what kind of situation he was walking into. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew this wasn't a big deal, but he also realized that this situation could be complicated if not handled correctly. "Well, officer," Mr. Thompson began, trying to keep his voice even. "As you can see, we're just having a family BBQ. There's no trouble here." Officer Jenkins looked around at the group, noticing the relaxed and friendly atmosphere. Everyone was having a good time. No arguments, no shouting, just a peaceful gathering. He glanced back at the neighbor's house, unsure of how to respond to the complaint. "I see," Officer Jenkins said. "It's just..." The neighbor was very upset about the noise. "I had to come by and check it out." Mr. Thompson nodded, understanding the officer's role but also feeling frustrated that a simple gathering had caused this trouble. He paused for a moment, considering how to handle this. "Well, officer," he said, his voice calm and composed, "I'm sure this isn't necessary. But I can tell you, everything here is fine. We're not causing any problems." The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. As the moment lingered, Mr. Thompson gave a quiet, reassuring smile. "If you'd like to speak to someone, my wife and kids are right over there. But I can assure you, we're just enjoying a nice afternoon." Before the officer could respond, Mrs. Thompson approached from behind. She smiled warmly and nodded in greeting. "Hi, officer. I'm Mrs. Thompson. Everything is fine here. We're just enjoying time with family." The officer looked at Mrs. Thompson, then back at Mr. Thompson. A small realization began to form in his mind. Something about Mr. Thompson seemed familiar, but he couldn't place it just yet. The moment stretched out, both sides waiting for something to break the silence. Finally, after a few seconds of awkward quiet, Mr. Thompson decided it was time to clear things up. "By the way, officer," Mr. Thompson added with a slight smile, "I'm actually the new police captain in this town." The officer's eyes widened. He blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. He looked back at Mr. Thompson, realizing the situation was far different than he had imagined. The words, "I'm actually the new police captain in this town," hung in the air for a moment, and Officer Jenkins stood still, blinking. For a few seconds, he didn't know what to say. The idea that the man standing in front of him, someone so calm and friendly, was the new police captain was a complete surprise. Mr. Thompson smiled politely, watching the officer's reaction. It wasn't unusual for people to not recognize him immediately. Being the new captain meant he was still building relationships in the community. But today, this situation was different. His position as captain might just change everything. Officer Jenkins cleared his throat and straightened up, his eyes widening slightly. "Oh, I didn't realize," he said, now sounding more cautious. "I'm sorry if I caused any confusion. I didn't mean to bother you." "It's all right," Mr. Thompson said with a kind smile. "I understand that you're just doing your job." He gestured toward the backyard, where the rest of the family continued enjoying their BBQ. "But as you can see, there's no problem here." Officer Jenkins nodded, still a little taken aback. "Right, of course. I'll let the neighbor know everything is fine." Mr. Thompson felt a sense of relief wash over him. He was glad things hadn't escalated further. It wasn't his style to create tension, especially when there didn't need to be any. But the situation wasn't over yet, and he knew that the neighbor would probably still have something to say. He just hoped things would calm down after this. The officer turned to walk back to his patrol car, but then stopped halfway. "I'm sorry about all this. I'm just starting here, and I didn't want to make things worse." He looked back at Mr. Thompson and added, "I didn't know who you were, but now I understand." Mr. Thompson chuckled softly. "It's okay. You were just doing your job. I respect that." The officer nodded, his face softening a bit. "I'll make sure to let the neighbor know that everything is okay, and there's no need for further concern." He turned and started walking toward his car, now seeming much less tense than when he had first arrived. As the officer got into the car and drove off, Mr. Thompson returned to the grill. He couldn't help but feel a bit of pride. His role as police captain was a big responsibility, but it wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about keeping his community safe, about making sure everyone was treated fairly. That included making sure no one was unfairly judged, like his family had been in this situation. Back in the backyard, Mrs. Thompson and the kids were still chatting with their guests, unaware of the tense few moments that had just passed. Mr. Thompson walked over to his wife, who was setting out some snacks on the table. She smiled when she saw him. "Everything okay?" she asked, sensing something had happened. He nodded, keeping things light. "Yeah, just a small misunderstanding with the neighbor, but it's all taken care of now." She raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. "Well, I'm glad it's over. The kids are having a great time." "They are," he agreed, looking over at the children playing nearby. He felt a sense of calm settle in again. This was what mattered, the joy and laughter of his family. The neighbor, across the street, was still inside her house, unaware that her complaint had been completely diffused. Mrs. Carter had no idea that the situation she had started would end so unexpectedly. As the sound of the police siren slowly faded away, the Thompson family felt a sense of relief. The officer had left, and it seemed like the situation had been settled. Mr. Thompson stood by the grill once more, feeling a mix of emotions. While he was glad things hadn't escalated, a small part of him couldn't shake the feeling that this could have gone differently. He didn't want to have to explain himself just because of the color of his skin or his family celebration. The backyard was quieter now, but only for a moment. As the laughter of the kids resumed, Mr. Thompson noticed his wife's eyes glancing toward the street again. She raised an eyebrow, as if sensing something wasn't quite over. "Is everything really all right?" Mrs. Thompson asked quietly, her voice gentle but filled with concern. "I think so," Mr. Thompson replied, trying to sound reassuring. The officer understood that we weren't doing anything wrong. "He's going to check with the neighbor." But just as he spoke, the unmistakable sound of another police car turned down their street. This time, the siren was louder and much closer. It wasn't the same officer from earlier. It was a different car, and it was pulling up to their driveway again. Mr. Thompson's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he didn't like the feeling that something was still wrong. He looked at his wife, who was already standing by his side, clearly puzzled by the situation. "Maybe it's another officer just checking in," Mrs. Thompson said, trying to make sense of what was happening. But Mr. Thompson wasn't so sure. He wiped his hands on his apron, taking a deep breath. As the new car came to a stop, he knew he had to face whatever was coming next. His family had already been through enough for one day. The officer stepped out of the patrol car and walked up to the driveway. He was older than the first officer, with a calm but serious expression. Mr. Thompson greeted him with a nod, trying to remain composed. "Good afternoon," the officer said. "I'm Officer Harris. I was asked to come over after the call from earlier." Mr. Thompson nodded. "I'm Mr. Thompson, and this is my family. What seems to be the issue?" Officer Harris looked at the BBQ, then back at Mr. Thompson. "Well, we received a complaint about a loud party. I just wanted to come by and see if everything was all right." Mr. Thompson looked around, clearly confused. "We're just having a family gathering, officer. There's no noise issue here." Officer Harris nodded but seemed uncertain. "I understand, sir, but we still have to respond to the calls, especially when neighbors feel uncomfortable." Just then, the kids started playing tag near the fence, laughing and shouting with joy. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, offering a warm smile to Officer Harris. "Everything is fine here, officer," she said. "It's just a simple BBQ with our family and friends." But Officer Harris didn't seem completely convinced. His eyes wandered to the house across the street, where Mrs. Carter was still standing in her window watching the scene unfold. The tension in the air seemed to grow heavier, and Mr. Thompson felt a growing frustration. "I'm sure it's all a misunderstanding," Officer Harris said, shifting his weight slightly. "But I'll have to go speak to the neighbor to confirm." Mr. Thompson nodded, holding his ground. "I understand, officer. Thank you for your time." As the officer turned to walk toward the street, Mr. Thompson glanced at his wife, his mind racing. He hoped that this would be the end of it, but something told him that it wasn't over just yet. Officer Harris walked down the driveway, his boots making soft sounds on the pavement. The Thompson family stood silently behind him, watching him approach the neighbor's house. Mr. Thompson could feel the tension creeping back. He was trying to stay calm, but he couldn't ignore the uncomfortable feeling settling in his chest. He turned to his wife and whispered, "This doesn't feel right." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her face serious. "I know. Why is the neighbor still making a big deal out of this? We've been nothing but friendly." Mr. Thompson sighed deeply, but before he could say anything more, the officer stopped at the edge of the driveway, looking back at the family. "I'll just have a quick word with her," Officer Harris said, his voice polite but firm. "I'm sure we can clear this up." The officer walked across the street to Mrs. Carter's house. She was standing at the window, watching every movement, as if she were waiting for this moment. Mr. Thompson, standing near the grill, couldn't help but wonder what Mrs. Carter was thinking. Why had she gone to such lengths to complain about something as harmless as a family BBQ? As Officer Harris approached her front door, Mrs. Carter stepped outside, her face twisted in irritation. She greeted the officer with a stiff nod, clearly not pleased that her complaint was being questioned. "I just don't understand why it had to go this far," she said, her voice sharp. "That family is disturbing the peace. They're too loud, and it's uncomfortable. I don't know why they have to act like this." Officer Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced back at the Thompsons' house and then returned his focus to Mrs. Carter. "I've spoken to the family, ma'am," he said. "They were just having a gathering, and from what I saw, there's nothing wrong. No loud music, no arguments. It's just a family BBQ." Mrs. Carter's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth as if about to say something, but then stopped herself. "But they're different. It's just not how things should be here," she mumbled, not meeting Officer Harris' gaze. The officer looked at her for a long moment. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "they are simply having a barbecue. No laws are being broken. And honestly, you called the police over something that seems completely normal. I'm sure you can understand why that might not be the best use of our time." Mrs. Carter didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, staring at the officer in silence. After a long pause, she muttered a half-hearted apology, realizing that the situation wasn't going her way. Officer Harris, sensing the end of the conversation, nodded politely. "Thank you for your time, ma'am. I'll let the family know everything is cleared up." As he walked back across the street to the Thompsons' home, he had a new understanding of what had just happened. He had been called to handle a complaint, but the deeper story was now clear. This was more than just a noise complaint. It was about assumptions, about judging people based on their differences. He felt a twinge of discomfort. It wasn't just about the BBQ. It was about the attitude that Mrs. Carter had displayed. The officer reached the driveway where Mr. and Mrs. Thompson stood, waiting for the outcome. "Well," Officer Harris began, "it looks like everything's cleared up now. I'll just let the neighbor know there's no issue." "Thank you, officer," Mr. Thompson said, offering a firm handshake. Officer Harris nodded and walked back to his car, leaving the family to resume their gathering. As he drove away, the Thompson family stood in their yard, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. The situation had been awkward, but they were relieved it was finally over. They could now return to their BBQ, but Mr. Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Carter's actions weren't just about noise. Something deeper was at play, and he couldn't ignore it. The police car finally disappeared around the corner, and the Thompson family took a deep breath. For a moment, the world felt still, like a cloud had lifted. Mrs. Thompson looked at her husband, her expression one of both relief and confusion. "Well, that was something," she said, a hint of frustration in her voice. Mr. Thompson nodded. "It wasn't exactly how I thought today would go." The kids, oblivious to the tension that had just passed, ran over, excited to show their parents the new game they had invented. The energy around the BBQ quickly returned to its happy, carefree atmosphere. The smell of food on the grill, the laughter of the children, and the music in the background brought back the feeling of normalcy. But in the quiet of her house across the street, Mrs. Carter stood by the window, watching. She hadn't moved much since the officer had left her doorstep. She had a troubled look on her face as she stared at the happy scene in the Thompsons' yard. A part of her felt embarrassed. She had called the police for something so small, yet now she realized it had been a huge mistake. The officer had made it clear that there was no problem, but it was more than just the noise. It wasn't just the gathering. Deep down, Mrs. Carter knew it was her own feelings that had led her to make that call, her own assumptions about people who were different from her. She thought about what the officer had said. They are simply having a barbecue. No laws are being broken. His calm response had made her realize how unfair her actions had been. She had let her discomfort, her own biases, cloud her judgment. She had assumed that the Thompson family wasn't right for the neighborhood simply because they were different, without ever taking the time to know them. Mrs. Carter had lived in this neighborhood for years. It was quiet, peaceful, and everything was just the way she liked it. But when the Thompsons moved in, something changed. The BBQ, the people laughing, the music, it all felt out of place to her. She had seen them as a disruption, a challenge to her idea of normalcy. But now, standing there in her house, she realized how wrong she had been. She felt ashamed of herself. In calling the police, she had tried to push them away. She had judged them for no reason at all, without even giving them a chance. She thought about how the officer had stood there, looking at her, as if he could see the truth in her actions. And now, Mrs. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that she had been the one who had caused unnecessary tension. It wasn't the first time she had made assumptions about people. She had done it before, but never had she felt the weight of it like this. She didn't know what to do with that feeling of guilt. With a heavy sigh, Mrs. Carter turned away from the window. Maybe, she thought, it was time to change. Maybe it was time to stop judging people by how they looked or where they came from. Maybe it was time to take a step toward being more open-minded and understanding. She didn't know if she would ever be able to undo what she had done, but she promised herself that she would try. The Thompsons weren't her enemy. They were just a family enjoying a nice day in their new home, just like everyone else. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident. The BBQ continued as planned, and the sounds of laughter and music filled the air once again. The kids played in the yard, their laughter echoing across the street, while Mr. and Mrs. Thompson chatted with their guests, enjoying the warmth of the summer day. But while the Thompson family had moved on from the awkward encounter with the police, the events of the afternoon stayed with Mrs. Carter. She couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that had settled in her chest. She knew that she had made a mistake, but she didn't know how to fix it. What was she supposed to do now? How could she make things right? As the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow over the neighborhood, Mrs. Carter sat in her living room, staring out of the window at the Thompsons' house. She could still hear the sounds of the party drifting across the street. She watched as Mr. Thompson, calm and composed, played with his children, smiling and laughing. His family was happy, and there was nothing wrong with that. It was clear now that the only thing wrong was her own actions. She thought back to the words the officer had said to her. "It's just a family BBQ. No laws are being broken." He had been kind, patient, and understanding. Mrs. Carter had never considered what it must be like for the Thompsons to be judged by someone who didn't even know them, simply because they were different. She realized that she had let her fears and misconceptions control her actions. She had assumed things about the family without giving them a chance, but now she understood how wrong she had been. Mrs. Carter knew she had to apologize, but the question was how. She couldn't just ignore what had happened, and she certainly didn't want to leave things the way they were. She thought about it for a long time, sitting in silence, her mind racing. Finally, she made a decision. The next morning, after thinking it over carefully, Mrs. Carter walked across the street. It wasn't easy, and she was nervous, but she knew it was the right thing to do. She knocked on the Thompsons' door, taking a deep breath as she waited. When the door opened, Mrs. Thompson greeted her with a warm smile, clearly surprised but friendly. "Hello, Mrs. Carter. Is everything okay?" Mrs. Carter hesitated for a moment, then spoke quietly. "I wanted to come over and apologize. I shouldn't have called the police yesterday. I made a mistake, and I'm truly sorry. I didn't understand that you were just having a family BBQ. I let my own biases get in the way, and I regret it." Mrs. Thompson stood still for a moment, then smiled. "Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it." She could see the sincerity in Mrs. Carter's eyes, and though the situation had been uncomfortable, she could tell that Mrs. Carter was truly sorry. "I understand that it's not always easy to change our thinking," Mrs. Thompson added, "but I'm glad you came by. It shows a lot of courage." Mrs. Carter nodded, grateful for the kindness in Mrs. Thompson's response. She realized that this was a small step, but it was the beginning of something important. Maybe, just maybe, she could start seeing people for who they really were, not for the assumptions she had made in the past. As Mrs. Carter walked back to her house, she felt a sense of relief. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was a good start. The neighbor who had once feared the differences between them had made the first move toward understanding. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she was ready to try. The days following Mrs. Carter's visit to the Thompson family were filled with quiet change. She had apologized, and while it didn't completely erase what had happened, it had opened a door to something new, something better. Mrs. Carter began to see things differently, not just about the Thompsons, but about how she saw everyone around her. She realized that assumptions could be harmful, and that taking the time to understand someone was much more valuable than jumping to conclusions. As for the Thompsons, they didn't hold a grudge. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson went on with their lives, grateful for the quiet of their neighborhood, but also proud of how they handled the situation. They knew that not everyone would understand them right away, but they were patient and kind, believing that time and good actions would help change hearts. One afternoon, several weeks after the incident, the Thompsons had another BBQ. This time, it wasn't just family and friends. They had invited Mrs. Carter over. It felt strange, but also right. They wanted to show that there were no hard feelings. It was their way of extending an olive branch and offering a hand of friendship. Mrs. Carter was hesitant at first. She wasn't sure if the Thompsons would truly want her there after what had happened. But when she arrived, the welcome she received was warm and sincere. She could feel the difference in the air, the kindness in the way they treated her. The Thompsons didn't see her as the neighbor who had called the police. They saw her as someone who had learned from her mistakes, just as everyone does at times. As they sat down together, sharing food and stories, Mrs. Carter realized just how much she had grown. She had learned a valuable lesson that she would carry with her. That judging others based on appearances or assumptions was not only unfair but also hurtful. She had learned that everyone had their own story, their own reasons for doing things, and that taking the time to learn about others was the only way to truly understand them. The laughter and conversation flowed easily that day, and as the sun began to set, Mrs. Carter found herself smiling. She was no longer the woman who had called the police in frustration and misunderstanding. She was a neighbor, a part of the community, and she had learned how to be a better person because of it. For the Thompsons, having Mrs. Carter at their BBQ was more than just about forgiving the past. It was about building something better. They had shown that kindness, patience, and understanding could bring people together, even when differences seemed to keep them apart. As the evening drew to a close, Mrs. Carter stood up to leave. She smiled at Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. "Thank you for inviting me today," she said. "I'm glad we could have this meal together. I've learned a lot from you." Mr. Thompson shook her hand, his face filled with gratitude. "We're glad you came. Sometimes it takes a little time to see things differently, but it's worth it." Mrs. Carter nodded, a sense of peace settling inside her. She knew she had made mistakes, but she also knew that the future was about growth and change. She had learned that it was never too late to be better. As she walked back to her house, she felt lighter, knowing that the neighborhood was a little more united than it had been before. And for the first time in a long time, she was proud of the steps she had taken to make things right.